Abram was a man in his mid-70s, settled in the ancient city of Haran when he first heard the call of God. Life in Haran was familiar, comfortable, and rooted. He was surrounded by family, possessions, and a predictable way of life. One evening, as Abram sat by a fire, reflecting on the day, the voice of God came to him. It wasn't an audible voice, but it echoed deeply within his spirit, unmistakable and powerful. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." The command must have startled Abram, but it was immediately followed by a promise so grand it seemed incomprehensible. God continued, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Abram had no children. His wife, Sarai, was barren, and they were both advancing in age. How could he become a great nation? Yet something in God's word stirred Abram's heart with deep conviction. The promises were too vast and too divine to be questioned. Abram knew that this was a call to faith, and faith did not require understanding, only obedience. Without hesitation, Abram obeyed. He gathered Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions, and they left Haran, not knowing where God would lead them. As they journeyed, Abram's mind pondered the magnitude of God's promises. He was leaving behind the security of the known, stepping into a future held solely by the unseen hand of God. The journey from Haran to Canaan was not easy. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unyielding. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of the promised land. Dust swirled around them as they led their camels, herds, and flocks through the wilderness. Sarai remained silent most of the time, her face veiled, yet Abram knew that she too was wondering about the future. Lot, young and eager, kept to his own thoughts, but the weight of the journey rested heavily on all of them. There were no maps, no specific directions, only the promise that God would show them where to go. Each morning, Abram would rise early and pray, asking for guidance. The journey was physically exhausting, but Abram's faith remained steady. With each step, he clung to the words God had spoken. "I will bless you. I will make your name great." It was faith that propelled him forward through the uncharted territory. Abram often recalled the conversations he had with his father, Terah, before they left Haran. Terah had started the journey but settled in Haran, never completing it. Abram wondered if the call had been on his family for generations. Now, it was his responsibility to carry out the mission God had set before him. Finally, they arrived in Canaan. It was a rugged and unfamiliar land, but God appeared to Abram again, this time with a specific promise. "To your offspring, I will give this land." Abram's heart must have swelled with a mixture of awe and confusion. Offspring. He and Sarai were childless, and Sarai was beyond childbearing years. Yet God's promise was clear and direct. To mark the significance of this moment, Abram built an altar to the Lord at Shechem. As the stones were placed one by one, Abram offered a sacrifice, his prayers ascending to the heavens. This altar would be a physical reminder of the covenant God had made with him, a testimony to his faith in God's word. The land of Canaan was filled with people, and Abram was a foreigner in their midst. But God's voice was the only one that mattered. Abram knew that his journey was not merely about possessing land. It was about the unfolding of a divine plan that stretched far beyond his understanding. Not long after settling in Canaan, a severe famine struck the land. The fields dried up, the streams ceased to flow, and food became scarce. Abram, responsible for the lives of his family and servants, made the difficult decision to leave Canaan temporarily and seek refuge in Egypt, where there was food. As they approached Egypt, Abram grew anxious. Egypt was a powerful kingdom, and Sarai's beauty, even in her older age, would draw the attention of the Egyptians. Abram feared that the pharaoh might kill him to take Sarai as his own. In a moment of weakness, Abram told Sarai to say that she was his sister, hoping that this lie would protect him. In Egypt, just as Abram had feared, the Egyptians noticed Sarai's beauty, and she was taken into Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake, showering him with gifts of livestock and servants. But Abram's conscience must have weighed heavily on him. His fear had led him to deceive, and now his wife was in the household of another man. God, however, intervened. He inflicted Pharaoh and his household with serious diseases, and when Pharaoh realized that Sarai was Abram's wife, he rebuked Abram for his deception and sent them away. Abram and Sarai left Egypt with more wealth than they had when they arrived, but the experience was a reminder that even in moments of fear and failure, God remained faithful to his promise. As Abram's wealth and livestock increased, so did Lot's. Soon, the land could not support both of their herds, and their herdsmen began to quarrel over grazing land. Abram, always seeking peace, proposed a solution to Lot. "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot, seeing the fertile plains of the Jordan, chose the better land for himself, moving his tents near the city of Sodom. Abram, on the other hand, remained in Canaan, trusting in God's promise rather than the apparent advantages of the land. After Lot departed, God appeared to Abram once again, reaffirming his promise. "Look around from where you are. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever." Abram's heart was filled with peace. Though he had given Lot the first choice, God's promise remained steadfast. Abram's faith allowed him to let go of the need for personal gain, trusting that God would provide everything he needed. Alone on the hill, Abram gazed at the land before him. The hills rolled gently, and the valleys were green with life. This was the land God had promised to his descendants, a land he had not chosen but had been given by divine decree. As he stood there, God's voice came to him once more, stronger and clearer than before. "I will give this land to your offspring forever." This reaffirmation came at a crucial moment. Abram had given up the better land to Lot, but now God was reminding him that his plan was not dependent on the land's fertility, but on his own power and promise. Abram could feel the weight of this promise, and though he still had no child, he believed that God would somehow fulfill what he had spoken. As Abram built yet another altar, his faith deepened. He knew that the fulfillment of God's promise was not tied to his own understanding or ability. His faith was growing, not because he could see how it would happen, but because he knew the one who had made the promise. Abram's faith was tested when news reached him that Lot had been captured during a war between the kings of the region. Without hesitation, Abram gathered 318 trained men from his household and pursued the invaders. He was a man of faith, but his faith was not passive. When action was required, Abram acted decisively. Under the cover of night, Abram and his men attacked the enemies, rescuing Lot and all the other captives, along with their possessions. This victory was not just a display of Abram's courage, but also of God's protection over him and his family. After the battle, Abram met with Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and a priest of God Most High. Melchizedek blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything, acknowledging that his victory was by God's hand. Abram's faith was growing not just in the promises of God, but in the knowledge that God was actively working in his life, guiding and protecting him. As Abram sat under the night sky, gazing at the countless stars above him, God appeared to him once more. Abram was growing older, and the promise of descendants seemed increasingly unlikely. "Sovereign Lord," Abram asked, "what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" But God had not forgotten his promise. He took Abram outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. God then made a formal covenant with Abram, instructing him to bring a heifer, a goat, and a ram. Abram obeyed, and as the sun set, a deep sleep fell upon him. In a vision, God reaffirmed his promise, telling Abram that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars and that they would inherit the land. As a sign of the covenant, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch passed between the pieces of the animals, symbolizing God's presence. Abram knew, without a doubt, that the promise was sealed by God himself. The covenant was not dependent on Abram's ability to fulfill it, but on God's sovereign will. Despite the promise, Sarai remained barren. Years passed, and the tension between faith and doubt grew. In her frustration, Sarai proposed a solution. Abram should have a child with her servant, Hagar. It was a common practice in their culture, but it was not God's plan. Abram agreed, and Hagar became pregnant. However, the situation quickly spiraled into conflict. Sarai, feeling resentful, mistreated Hagar, and Hagar fled into the desert. But God appeared to Hagar and told her to return, promising that her son would also become a great nation. Hagar bore Abram a son, and he was named Ishmael. Though Ishmael was Abram's son, God made it clear that the promise of descendants would come through Sarai, not through Hagar. Ishmael's birth was a reminder that trying to fulfill God's promises through human effort often leads to conflict and heartache. Yet, even in this situation, God showed mercy and promised to bless Ishmael. When Abram was 99 years old, God appeared to him again and renewed his covenant. This time, God gave Abram a new name, Abraham, meaning father of many, and Sarai was renamed Sarah, meaning princess. God also established the covenant of circumcision as a sign of the promise. Abraham's faith was tested once more. He was old, and Sarah was well beyond the age of childbearing. Yet God promised that within a year, Sarah would have a son. Abraham laughed at the thought. How could a man of his age and a woman of Sarah's age have a child? But God's response was firm. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Abraham obeyed God, circumcising every male in his household as a sign of the covenant. His faith, though tested by doubt and time, remained steadfast. He believed that God would do what he had promised, even if it seemed impossible. One hot day, as Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent, 3 visitors appeared. Abraham, ever hospitable, rushed to offer them food and rest. As they ate, one of the visitors, who was the Lord, announced that Sarah would have a son by the same time next year. Sarah, overhearing the conversation from inside the tent, laughed to herself. The very idea was absurd. She was old, and her body had long since passed the age of childbearing. But God heard her laugh and asked, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Sarah, afraid, denied that she had laughed, but the Lord knew the truth. In that moment, both Abraham and Sarah were reminded that nothing is impossible for God. His promises do not depend on human ability, but on his power. As the visitors prepared to leave, the Lord revealed to Abraham that he was about to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness. Abraham, knowing that Lot lived in Sodom, pleaded with God to spare the city if righteous people could be found there. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham asked. He bargained with God, asking if the city would be spared for 50, 45, 30, 20, or even 10 righteous people. God agreed, but in the end, not even 10 righteous people could be found. The next morning, Abraham stood on a hill, looking out over the plain. Smoke rose from the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. God had kept his promise to spare Lot and his family, but the cities were no more. It was a sobering reminder that while God is merciful, he is also just. After years of waiting, the promise was fulfilled. Sarah conceived, and in her old age, she gave birth to a son. They named him Isaac, which means he laughs, a reminder of both Abraham and Sarah's initial laughter and the joy that had now come to them. The tent was filled with laughter and celebration. Abraham, now 100 years old, held his son in his arms, marveling at the faithfulness of God. Sarah, too, was overwhelmed with joy, saying, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The birth of Isaac was the fulfillment of God's promise, but it was also a reminder that nothing is too hard for the Lord. Even in the face of impossibility, God had proven himself faithful. Abraham's journey of faith had been long and filled with challenges, but through it all, he had learned to trust in God's promises. He had left his homeland without knowing where he was going, trusted in God's promise of descendants when he had no children, and believed in the impossible when God promised a son through the Sarah. Now, as he held Isaac, Abraham could see how every step of the journey had been a part of God's plan. The years of waiting, the moments of doubt, the times of testing, all had been used by God to grow his faith. Abraham knew that God was faithful and that his promises would come to pass in his perfect timing. The story of Abraham is a testament to the righteousness that comes by faith. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. His life shows us that faith is not always easy, but it is always rewarded. With God, nothing is too hard, and his promises are sure, no matter how long the wait or how impossible they may seem. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.